Hello everyone! Today I want to talk about remote ID and do my best to break down the 470-page document that the FAA recently posted. So before I get started, I want to say that this is just my personal interpretation of the ruling as it is today. And if you want more information on this, I definitely want to encourage you all to go check out the FPV Freedom Coalition at fpvfc.org, as we will very shortly have some more information published on there, and we'll do our best to try to keep that up to date and get all of your questions answered. Okay, so you may have already heard about remote ID because a year ago at this time, the FAA released their proposal for rulemaking, or NPRM, related to remote ID. And I just want to say before we get too far into this that everything you heard about that, just kind of forget about it. It's not really relevant anymore. They changed a whole lot of things in the final ruling, so it's not so relevant anymore. And don't panic, because none of this happens immediately. There are two important dates in the final ruling for remote ID that you do need to know about. The first one is basically for manufacturers and when they need to comply with remote ID requirements, and that is 18 months and 60 days from the publication of this ruling. So that puts it at roughly September of 2022. But the more important date is when people like you and I need to comply when we're out flying with remote ID. And that is, let's see, just double check, make sure I get it right, 30 months and 60 days from the publication of the final ruling, which puts it at basically the end of August, the beginning of September of 2023. So we have some time, and a lot of things can change between now and then. So the really short explanation of remote ID is that the FAA wants all remote aircraft in the sky, for the most part, to be broadcasting a signal that lets anyone in the area know what the GPS coordinates of the drone are, what it's doing, how fast it's moving, where it took off from, all that kind of stuff. And to comply with that, that's what all of these remote ID regulations are for. And so this applies to both people who are flying recreationally and people who are flying commercially under Part 107. And the way that the regulation specifies this is they say any unmanned aircraft that requires registration in the United States has to abide by these rules. And so that means anyone flying any remote aircraft under Part 107 or commercial operations, it doesn't matter what the weight is, it can be 1 gram, it can be 5 pounds, anything up to 55 pounds. 55 pounds and over is a whole different category. So we're just talking 55 pounds and under. Every single one of those, if you're flying it commercially, has to follow these remote ID rules. And if you're recreational, it stops at 250 grams. If it's under 250 grams and you're flying recreationally, you don't currently have to register, therefore remote ID rules don't apply. If it's 250 grams and up to 55 pounds, like a typical 5-inch freestyle FPV drone, then these remote ID regulations do apply to you. So basically there are 3 ways that you can comply with these remote ID regulations. Number 1 is you can buy an aircraft that has been certified by the FAA to comply with the regulations. Number 2 is that you could retrofit your existing drone or your home-built aircraft and put a module on it that makes it comply with remote ID. Or you can limit yourself to only flying in FAA-recognized identification areas, also known as AFRIA. So the standard remote ID aircraft are ones that are specifically built to comply with these regulations. Their serial number has to be listed on the FAA's website, I think, for the most part. And there's a whole long list of regulations that a standard remote ID aircraft will have to comply with. I'm not going to go into the details of all of these because it's not that important. Well, it's not that it's not important. It's important, but it's not that interesting to most of my audience. Most of us are going to be doing home-built aircraft, not the purchased aircraft. And these rules are mostly important for the manufacturers. They have to create something that follows all these rules so that they can sell it. And it's still useful to know what some of these rules are if you're, say, going to buy an aircraft that complies with this. But for the most part, it just means that the FAA is going to have to certify them. They're going to have GPS. It's supposed to alert the operator if anything's going wrong and all that kind of stuff, and basically broadcast the GPS location of the drone at all times and the location of where it took off from. So the more interesting part to me is the broadcast modules. This is the option that's available for us home builders who are going to be building your, say, FPV drones and whatnot. And the module, which doesn't exist yet, of course, it's these regulations are sort of creating the framework for companies to create these modules. It has to be approved by the FAA. So, of course, that's going to increase the cost because whoever builds and designs these is going to have to go through the certification process with the FAA, and that's not going to be free. The operator must register the model's serial number with the FAA. So if you're a Part 107 pilot, you're going to have to register this module or register your drone with the module like you would normally register any drone. As a recreational pilot, you're going to have to go to the FAA's website and register this module. Also, there won't be, as far as I understand, there's not going to be an additional fee for that. You're just going to be able to add module serial numbers to your account so that the FAA knows that you're the owner of it. From takeoff to shutdown, the person operating the unmanned aircraft must ensure that the remote identification broadcast module broadcasts the remote identification message elements directly from the unmanned aircraft. So the module on your drone, while it's flying, has to be broadcasting the signal for anyone to be able to receive it. And it says the person manipulating the flight controls of the unmanned aircraft system must be able to see the unmanned aircraft at all times throughout the operation. Now, when I read this, that makes it sound like there's no way you could comply with this regulation with wearing FPV glasses or goggles, because you're no longer able to see the unmanned aircraft at all times throughout the operation. Now, as far as I know, the FAA isn't intentionally trying to make flying FPV illegal here. And Alex from the FPV Freedom Coalition did reach out today to the FAA's UAS hotline and asked them specifically, does this mean you can't fly FPV anymore? And they said, no, you should be able to still use a visual observer, but they were going to check with other people to double check on that, because the way this is worded, it definitely sounds like FPV is out of the question, but I don't think that that's the intent of the FAA. Unfortunately, they chose some poor wording in the regulation related to that. Next, it says, prior to takeoff, the person manipulating the flight controls of the unmanned aircraft system must ensure the remote identification broadcast module is functioning in accordance with subpart B. So I think when you power up your drone, it has to notify you that it is functioning properly, and they leave that up to the module manufacturer to decide how to do that. But of course, the FAA is going to be able to determine which modules they accept and which ones they don't. So we'll see how that works in the future. And finally, it says the person manipulating the flight controls of the unmanned aircraft system must land the unmanned aircraft as soon as practicable if the unmanned aircraft is no longer broadcasting the message elements. So somehow you're supposed to be able to know if the broadcast stops working, and it's supposed to notify you, and if you as soon as that happens, you're supposed to land as soon as possible. And that brings us to the third way of complying with remote ID, and that is if you don't have remote ID at all, you can still fly, but you have to fly within the boundaries of an FAA recognized identification area, also known as a FRIA, and that the person manipulating the flight controls of the unmanned aircraft system must be able to see the unmanned aircraft at all times throughout the operation, just like it was with flying with the module. So a little bit more detail on those FRIA locations. FRIA is a geographic area where persons can operate a UAS without remote identification, provided they maintain visual line of sight. And a FRIA can be established by a community-based organization, or CBO, that is recognized by the FAA. But they also added the ability for educational institutions like primary, secondary schools, trade schools, colleges, and universities to also request FRIA locations. And that the FAA will begin accepting applications for FRIA zones 60 days and 18 months after the publication of the rule in the Federal Register. So now that we've gone over the basics of the 3 different ways that you can comply with remote ID, let's get into more of the details of that broadcast module. The remote identification broadcast module must be capable of determining the takeoff location of the unmanned aircraft. So clearly the module has to have GPS and know its GPS location before you take off. It has to time mark all the message elements, and they must be synchronized with all other remote identification message elements. Prior to takeoff, the remote identification module must automatically test the remote identification functionality and notify the person manipulating the flight controls of the unmanned aircraft system of the results of the test. So, you can imagine it could have a beeper on it or something, and when you power it up, it gives you a tone that says all is well, and if there's a different tone, it says, it's not working well, you shouldn't fly, I guess. The remote identification broadcast module must continuously monitor the remote identification functionality from takeoff to shutdown and provide notification of malfunction or failure to the person manipulating the flight controls of the unmanned aircraft system. So somehow it's got to constantly monitor itself, and if it detects a failure, it's got to let the person flying know so that they can land immediately. Let's see, next is the remote identification broadcast module must incorporate error correction in the broadcast of the message elements. So it's got to be able to broadcast these messages in such a way that devices can pick them up and detect errors and fix them. The remote identification broadcast module must not interfere with other systems or equipment installed on compatible unmanned aircraft, and other systems or equipment installed on compatible unmanned aircraft must not interfere with the remote identification equipment. This one's going to be difficult because if you're building a really small, like 300-gram drone, you don't have much space in there. And if you're going to put this module on there, and if it's broadcasting, as they say it should, on like 2.4 gigahertz, and you've got your radio control link on 2.4 gigahertz, there's going to be some interference. There's no real way around that. Even if they're on totally different megahertz, like you're running 900 megahertz for your control link and you've got 2.4 gigahertz, if those antennas are really close to each other and their output is high enough, they're going to interfere with each other. So somehow, the rule says they can't interfere with each other. I don't know how they're going to get around physics there, but that's what the rule says. Next up, the remote identification broadcast module must be capable of broadcasting the message elements using a non-proprietary broadcast specification and using radio frequency spectrum compatible with personal wireless devices in accordance with Part 15 as Title 47, Code of Federal Regulations, when operations may occur without an FCC individual license. So basically this says whatever the current technology of personal wireless devices, like your cell phone, the broadcast from the drone has to be compatible with that. So that pretty much means if this was going live today, that would be 2.4 gigahertz Bluetooth or 2.4 gigahertz or 5.8 gigahertz Wi-Fi signals. And finally, the remote identification broadcast module must be designed to maximize the range at which the broadcast can be received while complying with 47 CFR Part 15 and any other applicable laws in effect as of the date the Declaration of Compliance is submitted to the FAA for acceptance. So the module has to maximize the range, so make it as powerful and detectable from as far away as possible. That's going to be an interesting one to see. Does that mean they have to have gigantic antennas on them to maximize the range? Does it mean they have to be very high power? Both of which those things don't play very well with our typical FPV drones. So you might be wondering, so what is in this broadcast that's coming out of your module on your drone, right? So it's supposed to contain a serial number assigned to the unmanned aircraft by the person responsible for the production of the standard remote identification unmanned aircraft. I'm not sure, and that wording is not quite correct there because they're talking about message elements in the module, and they copied and pasted the information from the standard remote identification aircraft. But or it can contain a session ID, which would sort of be a unique identification number assigned from the module itself. That also is a little bit confusing because that's almost sort of a carryover from the network-based idea they had and they totally dropped for this remote ID ruling. It also needs to contain the latitude and longitude of the control station. It has to include the geometric altitude of the control station. So it needs to know exactly where the person operating the controls is or was when they took off, maybe. An indication of the latitude and longitude of the unmanned aircraft itself, an indication of the altitude of the unmanned aircraft, and an indication of the velocity of the unmanned aircraft, as well as a time mark identifying the Coordinated Universal Time, or UTC time, of applicability of a position source output. So they, all these pieces of data are time-stamped, basically. And finally, it needs to have an indication of the emergency status of the unmanned aircraft. So if a motor fails and it's falling out of the sky, it has to broadcast that. Or if it goes into failsafe, it's got to broadcast that. I'm not entirely sure. That's going to take a little bit more research. And then the document goes into some of the performance requirements for the module and the messaging elements that are broadcast from it. And basically it's saying that the GPS information has to be accurate to within 100 feet of the true position with 95% probability. And that goes for the altitude and the longitude and latitude. And the altitude has to be within 150 feet of altitude with 95% probability. The takeoff position within 100 feet. The takeoff location within 150 feet for altitude. The remote identification broadcast module must broadcast the longitude, latitude, and altitude of the aircraft no later than 1 second from the time of measurement to the time of broadcast. So it's got to know your location and broadcast it within 1 second. And the remote identification broadcast module must broadcast the message elements at a rate of at least 1 message per second. So they want, they want as live of data as possible, and this is giving some parameters on how frequent and how accurate that data has to be. So that's about it. Those are the big highlights that I got out of reading most of those 470 pages of the FAA's remote ID ruling. If you've got any questions, definitely leave them down in the comments below, and I'll do my best to try to answer them. And thanks for watching. Oh, one more quick thing before I go. If you like that little tagline / logo thing I put at the end of my videos that says change your view, fly FPV, and if you get the double meaning of it, even better. But if you like that and want to have it on a t-shirt, don't forget that you can get one, just like the one I'm wearing right now. And you can also support the FPV Freedom Coalition in the process. To do that, just head over to the FPVFC's website and their store, so fpvfc.org/store, and pick one out for yourself.